Thank you very much, Nigel. It's a real pleasure to be back here, as Nigel says. I was here 10 years ago. At that time, I'd documented a decline in breeding waders on my patch in Hampshire, and I was working furiously to secure that money that funded the project that you heard about from Lizzie just prior to lunch. So it was very early days. We'd identified some of the issues. So it's fantastic to be back here and actually see the progress that you've made. And I'm really encouraged by the number of people in this room that are interested in this issue and sort of collectively determined to make some progress. We've heard predation mentioned a few times this morning, and my task today in the next 20 minutes is just to give you an insight into sort of why predation is such an issue, some of what we can do about it, and because it's controversial, what evidence we've collected for what works, what doesn't, and why I think evidence is very important for guiding our way forward on this particular issue. If we can come up with good evidence on what works, then we can start to educate and convince people, particularly policymakers, and we can start to make progress. So why are we in such trouble? We mustn't lose sight of the fact, and David touched on it nicely, I've seen it over the last 25 years during trips to Ireland, that agricultural intensification, that landscape scale. We heard about forestry from Patrick. It's landscape change that has led us to this situation. It isn't the predators. We've changed that landscape, so we've made it less suitable for the birds, but we've made it more suitable for these generalist predators to navigate those landscapes. So that's what the problem is, but we're faced with this acute problem now that we've got a demographic driver, which is predation pressure. So we're just simply losing too many eggs and chicks. And we've created a perfect storm. The reason we've got so many predators is because actually we don't have those apex predators, or not so many of them at the moment at the top. Historically, we'd have had wolves and eagles, for instance, that would have controlled some of those mesopredators like foxes. As I say, we've completely changed the landscape, but also we've got super abundant food. Where I come from in the UK, there's huge controversy about game bird releasing, for instance, and I think there's issues to address there. But there's a whole range of other food sources in the New Forest where we're currently doing some research. It seems to be anthropogenic food. So we've got foxes that are travelling up to 20 miles a night and are raiding pub car park bins, car parks where food waste is put out. We've got villagers in a national park regularly feeding foxes and kites because they don't appreciate that that has a knock-on effect to some of these declining red-listed birds. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the example, not quite up to date, they only go to 2019, but you can see at the same time that our curlew, for instance, have declined across the UK, our carrion crow numbers have rocketed. So that just gives you an idea of what's gone on. I've put up some examples of various studies. I don't pretend to know all the answers, and the examples I give aren't exhaustive by any means, but this was a meta-analysis by a Dutch researcher back in 2012. Just shows that nest failure rate across a range of wader species has increased over the last 40 years, and at the same time we've seen declines in wader chick survival. Which predators are we mainly looking at? The literature suggests that fox is number one when it comes to egg predation. A whole range of studies, RSPB camera studies, for instance, our own studies with temperature loggers show that most of those nests go at night. Badgers in there, crows are in there. When we come to chicks, we've got a different range of predators, and we tend to see more avian predation. In places like the Avon Valley, in some years, we get heron and egret predation, for instance. Up in areas of the Pennines, black-headed gulls are quite important. So the first take-home message is that it's not one predator everywhere. You need to take local conditions into account. Every situation is different. and that complicates the whole message. So in the short term, I think 3 elements are key. Habitat first. There's no point killing predators unless you've got near perfect habitat. So that's the first step. And then I'll come on and talk about exclusion fencing and then lethal control. And I will just touch on diversionary feeding. And this comes in where we're doing absolutely everything. We've put in a complete package, but we're still getting issues, and that's particularly around protected predators. In the longer term, I think we need to move away from just lethal control and think at scale. And again, David came up with that in his talk. We really need to work out how we're going to move up to a different scale from what the one that we're working at the moment. So habitat improvement, I won't dwell on this. Lizzie covered it nicely in her talk, but this gives you an idea of the sort of thing we've done in the Avon Valley, opening up the landscape, clearing scrub, and something that's not been touched on in detail yet today is there's clearly an interaction between brood survival and predation rates. So on our lapwing fallow plot work, we've found that a lot of those chicks simply aren't getting enough food. The nests survive quite well on those bare fallow plots, but the broods just aren't getting enough food. Some of those chicks are starving. At first glance, it looks as though everything's being predated, but a lot of those chicks are actually being scavenged after they've died. So I always put this picture up, a nice rushy ditch, and those rushes are just as important as the wet mud because that gives hiding places for the chicks if a buzzard flies over, for instance. If it was completely open, those chicks are picked off very easily. So there's quite a lot of detail needs going into getting those wetland habitats right. The encouraging news is that they're pretty simple to create, and the birds respond to them very quickly when you've got it right. Exclusion fencing we've heard quite a bit about, and it can be various scales, but it comes with its problems. So this is in Shropshire. Farmers were paid to fence off areas, but as soon as that silage harvest is taken, that nest becomes vulnerable. It sticks out, and although you've got a fence around it, the crows home in. You can obviously do nest fencing at various scales, so right from the individual nest scale, so quite a sort of reactive response, perhaps up to more planned seasonal fencing. So that might be, we heard somewhere this morning about fencing off whole fields, and I think that's a better approach. We're starting to think that way with our fallow plot work. The fences around the plots don't work so well because the chicks soon wander out as soon as they hatch. So actually, yes, I can see Katie there now. Fencing the whole field tends to be a better way to go, but it's not always as amenable to the farmers. And then right up to sort of reserve scale, permanent or semi-permanent fencing. So I've picked some RSPB examples. I'm very grateful to Graham White at RSPB. We've had very long discussions about predation management, best ways forward, and Graham's sent me a few slides to include. So an example from 10 reserves varying in size from pretty small to reasonable. Electric fencing alone, you can get about 70% nest hatching. These are lapwing examples. But combination fencing that excludes badgers, so the temporary fencing tends not to exclude badgers as well. The more permanent fencing excludes badgers better, and you get better results. That's fine on a reserve. It's quite impractical for your average farmer, of course. So again, it's scale, and it's perhaps thinking about how we work at a landscape scale with farmers adjoining reserves to help buffer some of those key hotspots where we do have productive populations in the landscape. And yes, those fences do help improve chick survival as well, so it's not just nest survival. Again, this works quite well for lapwing. It's not as easy for curlews. Lapwing are good because they nest semi-colonially. Once you've got the habitat right, you can actually suck more birds into an area, get them breeding at higher density, and then actually in semi-colonial situations, they're better at fending off those aerial predators by themselves. Curlews that are dotted at low density through the landscape, it's much harder to protect particularly the broods with fencing. So what about lethal control? And I think it's fair to say that RSPB particularly are finding that where they're doing electric fencing, actually topping that up, we heard somewhere this morning about topping up with lethal control really makes a difference. The best evidence we've got for the effectiveness of lethal control is from some work that I was involved in Northumberland. 4 large patches of heather moorland, previously unmanaged. We kept the habitat management going exactly the same, and we put 2 gamekeepers, one on each of 2 of those areas, for up to 8 years. And these are the sorts of results we found for lapwing, golden plover and curlew. So these are just the proportions of pairs that were fledging broods. You can see quite a substantial difference there for all 3 species. And more importantly, we've heard that these birds tend to be philopatric, particularly curlews are highly philopatric, I've highlighted there. So what we found over that time period was that in the presence of lethal control, we were seeing a 14% annual increase in breeding numbers, whereas in the absence of that lethal control, we were seeing a 17% annual decline. So that's important. We not only want to fledge more chicks, but we want to ensure that that population is continuing to grow. So some clear experimental evidence that it can be done. I've put in a Dutch example. This is black-tailed gobwit. And again, this was predator control and then largely fox control. There was a bit of corvid control as well. Radio tagged chicks. And just to make the point that this is the proportion of chicks that fledged. So you can see the similar colour on the left with no predator control. A tiny proportion of those chicks are fledging. But actually, even with quite intensive predator control, you're only fledging about a quarter of your chicks. But that is sufficient over the number of pairs to just get them above that threshold. And this is important. I've said that every situation is different, and timescales at different sites are going to be important. But all we need to do is start nudging that productivity above that 0.5 threshold for curlew, 0.7 of a chick per pair for lapwing. So long as we're exceeding that on average over 3 or 5 years, then we're going in the right direction. RSPB have done some quite large experimental studies that haven't shown the effect that we've shown in our experiments. And it gets complicated, but we're constantly learning from this. So not only the lowland wet grassland lapwing experiment that RSPB did, but more recently the LIFE project on curlew has shown responses of birds to the habitat management. So the birds, you can move around the landscape to some extent by getting that perfect habitat. But between those LIFE sites, there were quite different responses to predator control. And I'm actually talking to David Douglas at RSPB about sharing data on the intensity of our management, both at Otterburn and on some of those curlew LIFE sites, to see if we can tease out what it is that causes these differences between sites. An older study now, going back 15 years, but a meta-analysis. This is mainly wader data. Some of the studies are from game birds and seabirds as well. But it just gives you a feel for the sort of variation. So the vertical line is zero effect from predator management. You can see that in some studies, actually, it has no benefit at all, and actually the population starts to decline. In some cases, you've clearly got a positive response. But the point of putting this up is that it's very difficult to predict the effect of a particular prescription of habitat management and predator management. I think we need it both in combination, but I think it was mentioned in relation to the badger issue earlier, there are clearly annual variation. So in the Avon Valley, we see that it's the very dry springs that the badgers come down onto the wetter ground. Primarily, they're not hunting out lapwing nests, they've come for invertebrates, but if they stumble across a lapwing nest, they take it. And then for 2 or 3 years afterwards, we might not have an issue. So that creates quite a lot of noise in the response that we see. So as I say, we get annual variation, and we don't really understand how predation on waders relates to their other food sources. So waders are never the primary food source for these predators. A lot of them are feeding on rabbits, voles, and I think we better need to understand those cycling of the prey, and that will help us understand or even predict which years we're likely to see bigger effects on the waders. As I say, I'm exploring with RSPB sort of what level of control of some of these common predators is necessary. So just to give you an example, at Otterburn, we reduced the fox population by 43% and we reduced the crow numbers by about 80%. We're not looking for extermination, and even if we were, we would never achieve that. It's suppressing in that key breeding period the numbers of predators sufficiently just to tip the wader productivity over that threshold to take it from stable to slightly increasing. There are abiotic factors. We've got unusual flooding in the Avon Valley this winter, wettest I've seen it before Christmas. But typically when we get very wet winters, we tend to get better chick productivity because the valley stays wetter in the following summer. So there are all sorts of things, and flooding at certain sites can become a problem. Other protected predators are starting to become an issue, and this is always a question I get asked. Well, you know, if you do efficient fox and corvid control, won't other predators start to come in? We haven't seen that yet. RSPB have had some issues at Otmore in Oxfordshire, but that's very close to the main red kite release, the reintroduction down there. So I think it's site-specific. Yes, you know, we do see buzzards and kites chasing lapwing chicks, taking some in some sites, but I don't think at present it's sufficient if we've got efficient fox and crow control to be making a difference. I think we can still make a difference in the presence of some of these other protected predators. So a quick summary of what we can achieve. Nest fencing is quick, cheap, relatively inobtrusive. But for certain species, particularly curlew, I'm thinking it protects the nests, but it's not as helpful with the chicks. So perhaps the combination of lethal and fencing is useful. Temporary fencing is relatively cheap, but we've heard earlier don't underestimate the effort it takes just to maintain those fences and keep them in good condition. And perhaps you need to weigh that up with the cost of employing someone to conduct lethal management. More permanent fencing is suitable for some situations and is clearly most effective, but that's highly costly, and again, it needs continued maintenance. Lethal control takes competent people. A lot of training and competence is required. Perhaps the most tricky one is this PR. And I think that's why meetings like this, getting a whole range of people, Curlew Recovery Partnership, I sit on the steering committee, but we have RSPB, BTO, WWT, Natural England, and it's all, you know, organisational baggage at the door, cards on the table. What do we want for curlew, as Mary said? We all bring slightly different perspectives, but we've got a common goal. And I think that's very important when it comes to lethal control. Of course, it's emotional, it's controversial, so we need to do the science and gather the data to justify those measures. I think we also need to be honest. We have quite a few knowledge gaps. We don't really understand why we've got such high predator densities. We know that we've got very simplified landscapes that seem to have been amenable to these predators. It's very easy to study the birds, but actually I think we need to learn a lot more about how predators use landscapes, how foxes navigate landscapes. On wet grassland reserves, for instance, is it wise to put in lots of straight foot drain channels, or would we be better going for scrapes in the middle of fields? Although Lizzie showed, clearly these animals very quickly get a good knowledge of certain sites. So perhaps we need to work out how we effectively exclude them, not necessarily with fencing. I'm thinking ways of stopping them crossing ditches, for instance. There's a whole range of other pretty simple measures we could put in place. Alternative prey I've touched on. I think pheasant releasing could be a problem, but there's anthropogenic food and human behaviour that will influence predator behaviour and abundance. Most studies have looked at a range of species, but you'll have heard about general licences in the UK. I think we need better evidence on the impacts of individual species, and there's technology that we can use to help. Nest cameras are being widely used. Working for Waders in Scotland is amassing quite a lot of evidence, and that will help us with a more targeted approach, and that feeds into the PR around why we're doing this. If we can justify that we need to control carrion crows, say, but actually in a particular site, jackdaws really don't seem to be a problem, then why are we culling jackdaws? The more evidence we can get, the better we can justify whichever approach we decide to take. And I think we need to be aware that ultimately we might see some undesirable effects. We might start to see more predation from protected predators, and we need to think through a longer-term strategy for dealing with that. So I think there's more work to be done. Definitely improving chick habitats. I think we have the measures to protect nests, whether individually or at the field or even the landscape scale. Nest protection is relatively straightforward, and there are non-lethal methods you can use, but actually I see brood survival as the bottleneck now, and better understanding how to get those habitats right at sufficient scale for broods is important. I think longer term we need to start having difficult conversations with people. In the New Forest, for instance, I've said that fox food is an issue. We don't have wheelie bins. It's all put out on the side of the road in plastic bags. So Wednesday night, the fox goes round prior to the collection on Thursday morning, and half the bags are ripped open and scavenged. That's an easy problem to sort. But it's starting to talk and convey the problem to the local council in that case, people that perhaps we're not used to talking to and who don't understand what a curlew or a lapwing even is. So you're starting at quite a basic level. But it's not a particularly difficult nut to crack. And then I think ultimately, and I remember having this discussion with Mary, she said, well, curlew recovery, when I started with CRP, do you think it's achievable? And I said, yes, I think so. And then she said, time scale. And I said, well, 30 years, 40 years. Nigel said, I've been in this work 30 years. When I started mid-90s, I remember taking my local Natural England officer out, and he wouldn't admit that predation was a problem. The following year, I took him out and I showed him 6 predated lapwing nests, and the penny dropped, and he became my best ally and secured a bit of funding for me to do more predation research. So I'm encouraged that every sort of 10 years we take a step further forward. As we've heard, this issue is critical. We need to start moving a lot faster than we have done, but it does take time. What I'm encouraged about is that it is a people issue. It's not understanding the ecology. I think we know enough. I've said there's more we can learn. But projects like this, meetings like this, where we get motivated people in the room. And I've seen it with our farmer clusters. The key is having someone locally who understands the issue and drives and motivates others. You know, Mary's been fantastic at that at the national level for curlew. Michael's been fantastic, you know, locally, and I've seen it with our farmers as well. Just getting through and that personal touch is what makes the difference, and we will crack this issue. Thank you.